housing, justice issues, health, economics. And it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, but if there is a nucleus, if there is a yolk, it's housing.
You had Black folks living in these, and particularly in Mount Laurel, in the 1800s. And they were living in substandard housing. The town wasn't developed. So in the movement of, creating the suburbs, white folks moving out of the cities into the suburbs, the local laws used zoning to really exclude Black folks from moving into the suburbs and trying to exclude Black folks or move out Black folks who were already in the suburbs. So that's why we had the Mount Laurel case, when we had this community here in Mount Laurel was living here in substandard housing, and they made an appeal to stay here and then build multifamily housing. And the town pretty much told them no. At a historic Black church by Jacob's Chapel AME, the mayor met with the folks there trying to get zoning to build multifamily housing. And the mayor famously said, if you folks can't afford to live here, you just have to leave, not considering that they've been here since the 1800s. So we have this history of exclusion in this country and in this state, where Black folks were zoned out or excluded from moving in because of zoning law. So local zoning is a tool that folks use to make sure that Black and brown folks don't have access to housing.
So here you're going to give white Americans money to do what? Build a foundation. You want to tell us to lift up ourselves with our own bootstraps when we don't even have any boots.
If you have a mortgage, you live in subsidized housing. And so it's pitched in a way where those are entitlements versus subsidies, as opposed to like Section 8 vouchers from low-income people versus mortgage deduction or the bank or the federal government backing mortgages. It's the same money, it's the same resources, but one is frowned upon, or one has a stigma opposed to the other. As Dr. King famously said, the rich people get socialism and poor people get capitalism. So it's the same pot of money. It's the same money that our government spend on subsidies and entitlements. But one is labeled for folks who are high income, that's socially acceptable, while the other one is socially unacceptable, or we look at, or we're spending too much resources for the poor, when in actuality, the wealthy get way more government subsidies than the poor.
New Jersey has some of the worst disparities in regards to the racial wealth gap. Number one, so much of that has to do with the history of redlining, with the whole fact that housing and land covenants and all these different pieces which have come into place have historically purposefully left Black people out of home ownership. And so that in and of itself is a major piece. Again, being able to pass down generational wealth. So housing and security has always been an issue for Black communities, where we can live safely, where we can thrive, where we raise our families, particularly here in Trenton and throughout all Black communities throughout the state. Affordable housing, safe, secure housing is a major issue.
New Jersey is home to a lot of Latino families. We make up 30% of New Jersey's residents, but we still see big gaps in terms of home ownership and access to affordable housing. Immigration is a big factor, but Latino communities are very diverse. So it's important that we take into account all the different communities within our community. For example, the needs of a third generation Puerto Rican family would be very different than the needs of a mixed status family, like so many families from Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Mexico, and Colombia. And this issue of immigration status and whether or not they can access certain kind of affordable housing units or home ownership programs is a barrier in terms of bridging the gap.
Current measures say that if an individual were to rent a one-bedroom apartment while making minimum wage, they would have to work in excess of 160 hours a week. Who can do that?
Certainly there are some specific problems that are unique to, Latino communities. But often they're the same problems that everyone else has, and so sometimes folks pigeonhole us, politicians, so pigeonhole our communities to think, oh, this is a Latino issue. But no, every socioeconomic issue like housing is a Latino issue. Affordable housing is important to everyone in the community.
When it comes to people of color, more specifically African Americans, it's difficult for us to buy a home, to own a home. Sometimes we can't afford to rent. And that leads to a lot of instability when it comes to people worrying about eviction, homelessness, food security, poor health, poor educational outcomes, poor economic growth. So thus is the reason why the NAACP is continuously in this fight. We have been, we are, and we're going to continue to be, because the tentacles from housing discrimination touches all areas of our life.
Housing leads to so many other avenues, whether it be things like lead, which then can lead to mental health and criminal justice issues. Whether it be economic equity, wealth disparities in home ownership versus rental, whether it be issues of people coming home from incarceration and being kept out of affordable housing.
Current research shows that you can actually predict health outcomes by zip code. So basically where you live determines the quality of health and the quality of access to health care. The second issue that we see housing as directly connected to is educational equity. In 2018, the LAN, Latino Action Network, the NAACP, and several other partners filed a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey, citing that New Jersey still participated in de facto segregation.
We were able to work on a critical piece of legislation that affectionately named the People's Bill, that provided some of the best rental protections that that we saw nationwide because of COVID. It provided funds to go towards individuals that needed rental assistance, and it put frameworks in place to really curtail how landlords and developers could evict an individual if they had to during the pandemic. One call for has been, statewide rent control. How do we put a ceiling on prices until markets, families, and individuals can recover economically? How do we develop a supplemental voucher system that may be able to provide people with gap funding from what they can afford to what the landlord is currently asking for, so that they don't find themselves evicted? And lastly is really providing a way to really tackle the wealth gap in the state. How do we allow people to have a livable wage in the state of New Jersey?
So I think we've worked very hard through the Fair Share Housing Center, the Latino Action Network, to try to get the process, the legal framework from Mount Laurel back into the courts.
Racial, economic, and social integration is something that works when we invest in it, right? Giving people the opportunity to not just rub elbows with people from different races, but actually get to know them, actually be a part of their social circles, actually get involved in the community, school boards, police departments, firefighters, all the religious institutions that make up our social structure and our social clubs, that there are actually people working together, living together, playing together. I believe if we ever make the investment in creating integrated communities, you can have a town like Mount Laurel, who for years excluded Black and brown people from living in their community through zoning, now has embraced it, and not long ago elected his first Black mayor in Mount Laurel. And you can see the progress that's being made in certain parts of South Jersey, where towns now are embracing the diversity and then really bringing in integration. Again, integration and diversity is two different things. Diversity, you can have a diverse community but all segregated, but integration is when you have a diverse community all living together, socializing together, experiencing the community together, and that makes for a healthy whole community where folks actually can see the humanity in a person before they see the race and the culture. So that's why integration is important. It's not only make economic sense, it makes social sense and moral sense, because it's the right thing to do.